So Yellow Brick Games has released its first game ever, Eternal Strands, a single-player RPG that takes inspiration from games like Shadow of the Colossus, Monster Hunter, and even Dauntless. But does Yellow Brick Games have what it takes to merge such great titles into one? Hello friends, I'm Trevor, and today we're going to be taking a look at Yellow Brick Games' Eternal Strands to see if it's worth your time. I put 30 hours into the game, completed just short of every quest, and I think I have the answer. Let's begin. So before we dive on into the video, I want to quickly say that I want to set the expectations for the game a little bit better, because honestly the reviews I've seen thus far, besides from Skill Up and Legacy Gaming, seems to be a little bit unfair in my opinion. Unfortunately, there were quite a few reviews who obviously only played for maybe 2 or 3 hours before giving a review, and to be quite frank, that's just unfair to the developers. Yellow Brick Games is a small studio and it's pretty much their first game ever. That's not an excuse or anything, as in my opinion, as I said a second ago, the game is actually pretty solid regardless. But to expect something of an Elden Ring level game, in my opinion, it's just an unrealistic expectation, and I did see a lot of reviews being extremely unfair in that regard, and I think it's important to mention that. With that brief disclaimer out of the way, let's talk about the good and the bad in Eternal Strands. So starting with the good, I want to start at the very beginning, and that's the story. Now, I am not someone who is a massive story fan. You guys who watch my channel pretty regularly know I am not a big fan of stories. I don't care for them. What I enjoy most in games is making builds and fighting enemies, not necessarily looking at the narrative. With that said, it's pretty clear that the team at Yellow Brick Games put a massive amount of effort into it, not only the story but just the narrative overall. The voice acting has been superb considering how small the studio is, and while the dialogue options don't really have a major impact on the story, it does have a ton of information if you desire. You can simply just say, yeah, I'm done and I want to just continue the story, or you can get a much more deeper explanation. I'm not exactly sure how long the script is, but again, for an indie game, I think the narrative is probably one of the strongest suits of the game. The story isn't necessarily the most interesting, but the narrative is amazing, and that's a massive plus for me. Shifting gears to something a little bit more general, and that is to combat. Now, I think one of the biggest points of contention when it comes to Eternal Strands was the combat, and as far as I'm personally concerned, I found the combat to be pretty damn good. It's not anything super amazing by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a very fun system that works. You have the ability to use 3 weapons, a sword and shield, a 2-hander, and a bow. Each of these weapons has their ability to have their own substats and subtypes, which offer a decent variety of approaches to combat. You also have the ability to find different armor sets. Once again, each armor set has different passive effects and defenses to suit your playstyle. Will you have a AAA studio level RPG mechanics? Probably not, depending on the studio we're talking about, honestly. But what Eternal Strands bring to the table is more than good enough for what it is. You also have a large variety of spells that can be upgraded, once again adding to their customization. You can freely swap between the spells on the fly, which again adds to the combat, making it feel fast and fun. For me, when it comes to the combat in Eternal Strands, the game is very simplistic and to the point. There's not a massive skill tree, a ton of passive or anything like that, but straight, simple, to the point combat system, and that works really well in my opinion. When it comes to the open world, you have a handful of maps, I believe 8 if I'm not mistaken. Each of the maps, while not fully open world, is an instance but have some pretty good coverage. Each of the individual maps or biomes feel fairly different and offer enough variety of different enemies depending on the map that you're in. And again, while it's not the most intricate map, it still adds enough diversity in the map to make the player feel as though there's actual progression in the world. You have the ability to get quite a few collectibles if that's your jam, and scattered throughout the world, you'll notice different recipes that offer different armors and weapons that you can find to craft later down the line. Within the map, there will typically be a arc or a large monster that you can face, and depending on the weather, because yes, there is a weather system that can alter the map and how it works, it can dictate the different enemies within them. Speaking of creatures and arcs, within each of the maps, there will always be a large fellow to face off against, and for the most part, we'll talk about what I mean by that in a second, the arcs are pretty cool. Each of them has their own unique set of powers and styles to take them down, and in order to level up your skills, you need to take out their strands to get more powerful. Also, the game does have something of a Monster Hunter-esque gathering system. When defeating arcs in a very particular way, you can net yourself legendary crafting materials for your weapons and gear. And while we're talking about weapons and gear, this takes me to the base, which has some pretty good meta progression. As I said a second ago, you can craft weapons, armor, gear, and different parts that you've gotten from the arcs, and essentially craft gear how you see fit. it. There's also general progression within the base for salvaging materials you found out in the open world, and these can be used to upgrade all the different stations, which can contribute to better weapon crafting, the ability to level up spells, more potions and tonics, and overall just some pretty nice meta progression to once again make your character more powerful. Overall, Eternal Strands is what I call a good game. It has a good 20 to 25 hours, maybe a little more depending on how much you put into it, a pretty solid all-around gameplay and combat with great story and narrative and good exploration, and it's pretty much everything you would want from a single player RPG, and that's fine. If I'm being completely honest, I find it kind of strange that a lot of the reviews I saw were so harsh on the game for not having as much content compared to many other RPGs. As someone who is a full-time content creator, I personally find it hard to find time to play these games, and being able to jump into a game for 25 hours and just finish the game was actually pretty damn refreshing. We all know in 2025 there's a massive amount of games coming out, a lot of RPG games right around the corner, and spending about 300 hours into each one of them can be pretty damn exhausting. So again, for me, I felt like 25 hours felt like a really good place. I don't need 300 hours to feel like the game is worth it, in my opinion. This is Yellow Brick Games' first game, and honestly, in the future, I expect to see more added on this, and I think they have a really bright future. With that said, there is some bad that we have to talk about because I do want to give some feedback so the team knows exactly where to improve. Now, I hate to say it, but the bad comes down to facing off against the arcs. If I'm being completely honest, I found most of the early arcs to be very nice to face off against, but some of the later arcs were really difficult to play around, and a lot of the higher level arcs, typically like the Surgeborn, felt really bad to play against. For example, they were almost constantly grabbing you off of them and nearly constantly shaking you off. The Surgeborn, for example, had a body that required you to freeze them, and if you didn't freeze them, you couldn't grab on the body and climb up. The duration on those parts being frozen, on top of him constantly, near constantly grabbing you, as well as shaking you off, felt like a very frustrating experience. And we're not even talking about the fact that he had abilities that would suck you in and pull you all around the map. Overall, the balance on some of the arcs were really atrocious, and it made the game feel unfun to me. If I'm being honest, most of the arcs needed a little bit of work. Typically, the grabbing ones were a little too grabby and the hitbox were a little wonky, and the ones who flew, they flew way too much, and it was really hard to get them to come down, again making the game feel a lot less fluid, which is actually kind of a shame considering the game's biggest draw is facing off against these huge Colossus style monsters. I know the team is doing some balancing things in the future, and I've seen that they have a roadmap coming up in the next couple of days, so hopefully they can address some of these issues, but as of recording this video now, I think the worst part of Eternal Strands were actually facing off against the arc due to some of the clunkiness and the balance. And this kind of leads me to the next issue, which is the inventory and material loss system. Now personally, I don't feel like this mechanic really had a place in the game. Losing your material felt like an unnecessary punishment, and for players like me, the extreme vast majority of the reasons I died in Eternal Strands was due to falling. That's because of the egregiously bad stamina system, and once again, the climbing system not being very good and fluid at all. When you die, you have to choose between a handful of items. When you fully max the station out, you'll be able to grab about 7 items. The problem with this system is that it discourages players from exploring and facing off against opponents, and the punishment, in my opinion, was significantly too high, especially when you're farming for arcs. In a lot of cases, they just simply throw you off of the map and you lose all your materials besides the one you save, and this honestly just felt bad. A better way to balance this would be if the arc physically dealt some form of damage to you and killed you. Only then should you lose materials, but being thrown off the map should never be the reason to lose materials. I think this felt very clunky, and again felt like an unnecessary punishment that I think the team need to take a better look at. When it comes down to it, I think most of the problem that the game has is from balance perspective. For example, elemental damage balance felt really wacky. Things like fire was really manageable, but things like cold was nearly impossible to deal with. Not only does this mechanic slow you like to a halt, you also dealt damage over time, which felt kind of silly considering fire kind of did the same thing, but with no slow, making ice significantly worse to play against. And whenever the weather effect was frigid, there was almost no time I felt like I would ever go to that region. I would just simply sleep and move past it, which once again kind of make the balance feel really wacky. For my final criticism, I want to say that I felt the game lacked something, and that lack was tools. There was a lot of situations where monsters, for example, as we said about the arcs, would just simply fly in the sky, and we really didn't have a tool to take them down. It was really frustrating just to sit there and wait for them to maybe come down if they decided to, and it was just not fun. Also, chasing the arcs around the map didn't feel very good either. They kind of just flew around for nothing, and once again, the flyers were just tuned so poorly. The thing with games like Monster Hunter, where you hunt huge monsters, tend to have the ability to give you a ton of tools to pretty much deal with them. For example, you have flash pots that deal with flyers, you have mantles that deal with a large variety of elemental conditions and just mini conditions, you have a lot of healing tools, a lot of status resistance tools, and overall you have the ability to kind of deal with monsters, which this game lacked. I'm gonna chalk most of that up to just being a small studio and it just doesn't have the funding to finish it, but again, for future games, I would like to see you put a little bit more emphasis on giving players the tools to deal with the monsters. With that said, what is the final verdict? And for me personally, I would recommend Eternal Strands. The game tries to stay in its lane and it doesn't try to overreach, and that's a problem a lot of games actually struggle with in 2025. You're gonna get 25 good hours of really solid overall combat, nothing super intricate, but good enough that, you know, it's a RPG system. You have the ability to craft gear, hunt monsters, and able to complete a really well told story. I think they've done a phenomenal job, and overall, once again, highly recommend the game. Personally, I do think the criticism on the game was a little bit too harsh, and I can safely say I enjoyed the vast majority of my playtime in Eternal Strands. With that said, guys, that's gonna be it for this review. Let me know down in the comments what you think about Eternal Strands if you got your hands on it and was able to jump in and play it. I'd like to know what you guys' thoughts on it were, because honestly, like I said, for a small studio, I think Yellow Brick Games done a really good job. But with that said, just keep in mind here at Forever Gaming, I'm going to be covering all things RPG, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel to keep up with that. We have a lot of exciting titles coming up in just a few short days here on the channel, and I'd love for you guys to stick around and enjoy the content. Keep in mind, we also have a Discord. If you want to sit and chill with some like-minded people, come hang out. And just like that, guys, I'll see you in the next Eternal Strands video very soon.